In this week's video, I'm going to take a look at what is a telephoto lens, what is it good for, how will it affect your photography, and what about focal length? All this and more coming up. Hi, Paul here from Photo Genius. Welcome to my channel where I post weekly photography tutorials. I share tips and tricks. Occasionally I do gear reviews as well. If you're new here and you want to get more from your digital camera, please consider subscribing to the channel. This week's video is all about telephoto lenses. Now maybe you have one and you're not sure how to get the most from it. Maybe you're considering buying a telephoto lens. In this week's video I want to tackle some of the most asked telephoto questions, including of course what makes a lens a telephoto lens. This is a great place to start if you're a beginner. So a telephoto lens is defined as a lens that has a longer than standard focal length. Now this creates a very narrow field of view, which in turn allows us to bring our subject much closer, and we commonly call this zooming in. Now I think this already sounds a bit too complicated, so let's just go over this again but break it down. A telephoto lens is a lens with a longer than standard focal length. But what is meant by focal length? Well, this is a great place to begin. Every lens has a focal length, and this is a number shown in millimeters. This may be a single number if the lens is a prime lens, but more commonly two numbers are shown indicating the lens is a zoom. Now when we take a picture, the light passes through the lens, and the focal length is a measurement taken from where the light converges and the sensor. With a telephoto lens, the lens is of course longer, hence the distance between the 2 points is greater, so now we have a longer focal length. Most consider a standard focal length to be between 50 and 60 millimeters, so a telephoto lens is a lens with a longer than standard focal length, and there are many to choose from. Now let's take a look at how the focal length of a lens affects the field of view. Now in a moment I'm going to go over this one in a bit more detail, but I do think it's important to understand a term that you're going to hear a lot in photography, and this is field of view. Let's begin with a short focal length lens, for example 18 millimeters. With this lens you get a wide field of view, but if you swap this lens for a telephoto lens, then the view becomes very narrow, and this greatly affects what the camera can see and capture. So a narrow field of view allows us to bring our subject closer, also known as zooming in. And this is because as the field of view narrows, the subject appears larger and larger within the frame. So now we know that focal length affects field of view, which in turn affects how large the subject will appear in your frame. Now I wanted to back this up with a practical demonstration, but I needed a big open space. So I chose a football field, and I want to say a big thank you to the local football team, Wynnum Wolves, for allowing me access to the pitch. For this demonstration I'm using the Canon T7 or 1500D, and I'm starting off with the standard 18 to 55mm kit lens that most people own. So I set myself up in the goal area at one end of the pitch, with the camera pointing at the goal on the opposite end of the pitch. I then proceeded to take a series of images using different focal lengths, starting with a short focal length of just 18 millimeters. This gives us a wide field of view and a feeling of space. Now as the focal length of the lens is increased, so the field of view narrows, and you will see the goal at the opposite end of the football pitch getting closer and closer. 55mm is the maximum focal length on the kit lens, so it was time to swap to the telephoto. Starting with a focal length of 75mm, then increasing to 100, 200mm, and finally 300mm, which is the maximum focal length for this lens. Another look at the images in sequence, and it's clear to see how focal length affects field of view and the ability to zoom in on a subject from afar. So now we know a bit about the basics of how telephoto lenses work. What are they good for? Well, generally speaking, telephoto lenses are ideal for subjects that are further away. For example, sports photography and wildlife photography. This photo of the moon behind me was shot with a Canon T7 and a budget Canon 75 to 300mm lens, and with this image you can actually see the craters on the moon, which is pretty cool. Now, another feature of telephoto lenses that often gets missed is that they have the ability to blur backgrounds. So if you want to take a picture of a subject and you want the background to be soft and out of focus, a telephoto lens may help you achieve that look. The look, by the way, is called a shallow depth of field. I've covered it in a separate video and I'll put a link up here and also in the description below so you can check it out later. Now, telephoto lenses also compress perspective. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail in this video, but I can tell you now, if you like doing portrait photography, again, a telephoto lens may be the one to grab. A very popular focal length for portrait photographers is 85mm. Now, there's certainly a few things you need to be aware of if you want to get the most from your telephoto lens, and the first one is camera shake. Put simply, the more you extend the focal length or the more you zoom in, the more exaggerated any movement of the camera will be. Let me give you an example. Here's a single frame taken from a short video that I took recently using a Canon R6 and an 800mm telephoto lens. Now, if I run the clip, you will see just how I struggled to keep the camera steady and track the subject. Using a short focal length lens, the field of view is much wider, so notice how when the camera moves, the subject still is within the camera's view and can still be captured. But with a long telephoto lens, the same amount of movement is exaggerated due to the narrow field of view. It's now much harder to keep the subject in view. Now, to really illustrate just how sensitive to movement cameras can be, especially when using telephoto lenses, take a look at this clip. If you look very carefully, you will see some very slight camera movement. Now, believe it or not, this is caused by the camera shutter opening and closing. So the camera was on a tripod, but still the shutter alone is enough to cause vibration. Now, unwanted camera movement could sometimes be the difference between a sharp photo or a blurry photo. Now, in just a moment, I want to fix this. I've got a really good tip for you, so I hope you're going to stick around and enjoy the rest of the video. Now, next I want to mention how adjusting the focal length of a lens affects the aperture. Now, this is true of most lenses, but can really be a problem when using long lenses. Now, this is the 75 to 300mm telephoto lens from Canon, and at 75mm, the widest aperture I have is f4. Now, if I zoom into the maximum focal length, which is of course 300mm, f4 closes down to f5.6. So I can zoom in and make my subject closer, but that comes at a cost. The aperture closes down, I lose some light, and this could be a problem when shooting in low light or shooting moving subjects or sports. Now, of course, like most things in life, you can spend a bit more money and you get more features. So this is the Nikon 70 to 200mm f2.8 lens. Now, as well as better build quality, the maximum aperture on this lens is f2.8, which is significantly wider. So this lens performs much better in lower light conditions. Now, not only does it have a wider aperture, but this lens also has a constant aperture. Now, this is great because I can set the aperture at whatever I like, let's say 2.8 for example, and I can adjust the focal length of the lens, but it doesn't impact the aperture. The aperture stays constant, and this is a big plus, but of course it does come at a cost. Okay, so now it's time for some telephoto tips. Now, I can tell you from experience that holding a camera steady when using a telephoto lens can be really tricky, particularly if it's a heavy lens and a heavy camera. Now, of course, a tripod is a must-have bit of kit, but a tripod does restrict your movement somewhat. So if you're doing sports photography or maybe wildlife photography and you need to follow the subject, I recommend picking up a monopod. Now monopods are fantastic. I use mine all the time, particularly when using telephoto lenses. They're small, light, easy to pack down and set up, and they bolt onto the bottom of the camera, sometimes onto the bottom of the lens itself. They are pretty awesome. Now if you want to find out more, check out my recommended monopods in the description below this video. This next tip is really designed for when you're using the camera on a tripod. For example, when I shot this moon photo, I had the camera on a tripod to try and eliminate any shake. Now, a few moments ago, I showed you a short clip where you could see movement caused by the camera shutter opening and closing. I promised you a fix for this. Here it is. If you're using a mirrorless camera, check out the menu and you may find an option called electronic shutter. Now this means the camera will not use the mechanical shutter, instead it uses the electronic shutter, and there is no movement then, and that fixes the issue. Now if you've got a DSLR camera, turn on the live view mode. Now this locks the mirror inside the camera in the up position, and the mirror is the common cause of vibration in DSLR cameras. Now unfortunately we can't get around using the shutter, it still has to open and close with DSLR cameras, but this can make a huge difference. Now the next tip I want to share with you is absolutely hands down one of the best tips ever if you're using your camera and a telephoto lens handheld, and it goes like this. Try and make sure that the shutter speed you're using is fast enough to eliminate any camera shake caused by using the longer lens. Now, to calculate the shutter speed, there is some maths involved, and if I'm honest, I'm not a big fan of maths, so I'm going to try and keep this nice and simple. And of course, if you don't get it first time, just rewind and watch it again, because trust me, this is an excellent tip. So if you're using a standard lens on a camera and you're using the camera handheld, it's fairly common knowledge that you want to make sure your shutter speed is 1/60th of a second or higher to avoid camera shake. Now, as we've learnt in this video, telephoto lenses exaggerate camera movements, so we have to recalculate the minimum shutter speed that we can use based on the focal length of the lens we are using at the time. And to do this, we take the focal length of the lens, multiply it by the crop factor of the camera we're using to give us our minimum shutter speed. Let me give you an example. Let's say we're using a Nikon D3500 DSLR with a 100mm telephoto lens. The crop factor for this camera is 1.5, so 100 times 1.5 equals 150. So now we have the number to base our shutter speed on. Now there is no shutter speed that is 1/150th of a second, so what you need to do is round it up to the nearest shutter speed. 1/160th of a second is ideal. Now remember, this calculates the minimum shutter speed, so of course you can use a faster shutter speed and it won't be a problem. Just don't go below this shutter speed, and this will help you eliminate camera shake. So let's run through that once more, but this time let's imagine we're using a Canon T7 and a 200mm telephoto lens. So the focal length, as we know, is 200. The crop factor for a Canon T7 is 1.6, which is different to the Nikon cameras. So 200 times 1.6 is 320. And as luck would have it, there is a shutter speed that perfectly matches 1/320th of a second. Now again, a reminder that you can choose a faster shutter speed if you wish, just don't go below the suggested shutter speed if using the camera handheld. Now I'm not going to go into detail about the crop factor in this video, but please note that it will vary depending on the camera. To find out the crop factor of your camera, just check out the list that I've included below this video. Should I buy a telephoto lens is one of the most asked questions that I get when I'm running my photography courses and workshops here in Brisbane. And the answer to the question, of course, lies in what you like taking photos of. So if you find yourself often photographing things that you just can't get closer to, then a telephoto lens is going to make a big difference to your photography. I'm thinking your kid's sports day, sports generally, wildlife photography, your dog running around the dog park, that kind of thing. And of course, as well as getting you closer to the subject, there are some added bonuses with telephoto lenses as well, such as blurring backgrounds and compressing perspective, which is the reason why a lot of portrait photographers choose to use telephoto lenses as well. In the description below this video, I've listed some of my favourite telephoto lenses for you to check out. Now, there is a subject that I purposely have chosen not to talk about in this video, and this is something called the crop factor. Now, the crop factor is about how the sensor size in a camera has a knock-on effect with the focal length. Now, whilst it might be relevant to this video, I think the crop factor needs a video of its own. If this is something you'd like to see from me, let me know in the comments below. I want to say a big thank you for watching this video and for supporting my channel. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up because it really helps the channel grow. I put out new videos every single week, so if you're not already subscribed, consider subscribing. And if you want to say hi or leave a question, you can do so down below. Hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya. Bye.